inoculate my kids right here, right now. And within 48 hours, his grandson was dead, and his granddaughter had polio.
Oh, my God. All right, what was the fallout after that with him?
Well, the first thing they did was they withdrew the Salk vaccine. Salk lived out his life on the bluffs of Santa Barbara. He's got the greatest PR organization in the world. And he got an award from President Eisenhower on the lawn of the White House. But people forget that his vaccine backfired on launch and was withdrawn. And what they did, they turned to another vaccine developer, Albert Sabin, and they said, what would you do? And he said, well, you got these three flavors, heavy, medium, and light. Just use light, because it really doesn't do anything except give you like flu-like symptoms, and it doesn't kill or maim. So they deliberately left polio light alive. It's called the live virus vaccine. In the polio vaccine, they grew it on monkey kidney cells, and they started out injecting it with a syringe into the veins. And after a while, they figured out they could just put a couple of drops of monkey viruses into a sugar cube. And you, to answer your question, probably got the sugar cube just because of your age.
Probably did, if I remember.
And the little white cups stacked up on the school cafeteria tables where we were all. In fact, I remember standing in line with those little white cups and the sugar cubes in there, and I saw the kids in line, and I'm in New Orleans at the time, pocket the sugar cube. And I said, what are you doing? He said, it's all full of monkey pus. I'm not taking that thing.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about Bernice Eddy. So she says, don't give this out. Don't do this. Did she have any clout to stop it?
No, because the people she reported to refused to do it. Now, all those people were fired, okay? When heads rolled everywhere, the head of National Institute of Health was fired. An entire group of people handling this thing were fired. And Eisenhower's president at this time, and he turns to Nixon and says, you get this thing back on track. We promised these people a vaccine to stop this epidemic. And you got to remember this. This goes back to FDR, okay, who had polio, and the March of Dimes, and there was like a media hysteria about polio. And it was, polio is a bad disease, and they had the iron lungs and all this other stuff going on, and there were about 35,000 cases a year that translates to 125 kids a day getting polio. So there was a lot of urgency on this.
Proponents, Ed, of the vaccine still say that it eradicated polio. Not true?
I'm going to leave that to others. I've read a lot of stuff that said the disease was on the decline in the first place.
And would have gone away by itself.
Right, and I have some other views on that, but as you know, I'm not a doctor, and I need to respect that there's certain edges of things that I don't want to talk about on the radio.
Fair enough. Okay, so so we've got this epidemic. You believe through your investigation it's based on this contaminated monkey virus that is in millions of doses, and now you're saying they finally pulled it off the shelf, or what happened?
They pulled the first one off the shelf. That was the Salk vaccine. Then they came back in 1956, 57 with the Sabin vaccine. And that is the one that got the bulk of the distribution. Most of that 200 million doses was Sabin's vaccine. And it was
and that was contaminated.
Yes, but they didn't realize it until they had already released 100 million doses.
Oh, my God.
Now, at that point, they got to say, put yourself in their shoes. What do you do? Well, the first thing you do is you say, this is now a national security secret, and nobody's allowed to talk about it because I don't want somebody chopping off my head, all right? The second thing you do is you say, let's get busy trying to figure out a solution. Now, what would be the solution? Well, the people involved, the people who discovered this are Sarah Stewart and Bernice Eddy, and we know from that Time magazine article that they believed that a vaccine was possible. Now, when you're looking at polio, you've got heavy, medium, and light, but you're looking at SV40 here, the virus that contaminated the polio vaccine. They only got one flavor of it, and it's bad. So if they can get that virus to mutate into a weaker form, then they can use that weaker form, just like Sabin did, as a vaccine. So how do you get a virus to mutate? How do you mutate something? Well, why don't we use radiation? We got this nice machine here called a linear particle accelerator, and it will create a beam of radiation that we can just turn the dial and control the wavelength and strength of, and we're going to set this facility up. We don't want this up here in Bethesda because we don't want everybody poking their nose around on it. We're going to put this way down in New Orleans because we want it close to Dr. Ochsner, who is president of the American Cancer Society, and he's the guy that lost his grandson to the polio vaccine, and we want him to supervise this project. And so we're going to build this facility. We're going to set this facility up 1/2 a mile from his personal residence.
And is that the one that Mary Stuart Sherman was working at?
Yes.
Okay.
That's where, in my opinion, that's where her arm got blown off.
All right. Okay. So they bombard this mutated virus. They mutate it. What happens to it?
Well, time frame, we're now in 1960-61, and I've tracked down people from Army bioweapons who are, working within 1 mile of the facility and stuff like this. They're trying to do this for the purpose of creating an anti-cancer vaccine, but right at that time, what happens? Fidel Castro takes over Cuba and moves Russian nuclear missiles into Cuba, and New Orleans is now within the range of the missiles. Now, I grew up in New Orleans, and I can tell you the hysteria of Cold War mentality that was alive and well in the city at the time, because that blockade, the embargo that we did on Cuba, which is still in place, cost New Orleans about 25% of its trade, which is like, cutting 25% of cars out of Detroit or something. It was a big issue to the economy in New Orleans. And the threat of Castro was that he was going to take his revolution to the rest of Latin America and wipe out the rest of our trade. And now he's moving in Russian missiles with a 600-mile range, and we're 450 miles away from them. So, the idea that Castro was a real problem to New Orleans was a very big idea. And what this is going on in the background, meanwhile, they're roasting these monkey viruses with the radiation, and guess what? They're discovering that it's making the cancer more aggressive.
It's not killing it. It's not slowing down. It's becoming out of control, isn't it?
More aggressive. And they say, well, if we promised, the government of the United States promised the Russians that we wouldn't go into Cuba as part of the deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they start looking, and this is very well documented, they started looking for alternative ways to kill Fidel Castro. We've all heard about the exploding cigars and those things. Well, one of the ways, which is documented in some books, about people like Sam Giancana and stuff, is that they were looking for an injectable cancer agent. And this is what's called basically the touchdown play that they wanted to do. And they were going to smuggle this into Cuba and have somebody give it to Castro. I personally think this is kind of a harebrained scheme, but the people at the time were very serious about this. And so they made the decision to weaponize the cancer. And by continually, they set up a loop of laboratories across New Orleans. These were all cellularized and secret facilities. And in order to do this, you have to have a lot of mice.
All right, hold on right there, Ed. We're going to come back and get more of this story. Then there's a tie-in with Lee Harvey Oswald and JFK as well. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest tonight, Edward Haslam, Dr. Mary's Monkey. More to come on Coast to Coast AM. And if you're just tuning in, we're with Edward Haslam, his work, Dr. Mary's Monkey. We're talking about the viruses and contamination. Now, you talk about that they decided to weaponize the cancer for a biological weapon. Let's pick that back up, Ed.
Right. We're now at the heart of this story, and this story obviously has a lot of moving parts to it, and it's a lot for a radio interview, but I'm happy to talk about it on the radio, but I